So maybe for the past unit of apes, maybe y'all be talking a lot about the environment. Let's start talking more about humans and how humans affect our environment. So we're going to be talking about the ways where we grow food, how humans raise animals, how we extract resources, how we live, how we fish, and how we can do all of those things more sustainably so that our environment doesn't go bad in the future. So let's start off with something known as the tragedy of the commons. Of the commons. Now, essentially, what happens in the tragedy of a commons is you have a resource. Let's just say the simplest example that you'll probably hear of is you have a pond, and the pond is filled with fish, which is represented by the yellow dots. Now, the tragedy of a commons, this, let's just say lake right over here, it has to be a public resource, meaning that many people, from outside can use it. And what starts to happen is that, well, people, us humans, will actually overuse this resource. Let's say this is human one, this is human two. They'll start fishing a lot, and they'll be taking more fish than, well, the fish can reproduce. So eventually, in the long term, we will run out of fish. And the reason why this happens is because this is a public resource, meaning that nobody wants to really take responsibility for what they do because, well, it's public, right? So they don't actually own the lake, meaning that they don't really have to suffer the consequences of overfishing. All right. Think about, I don't even know. Dude, think about the Chinatown bathrooms, man. The Chinatown bathrooms are nasty. People be like using the bathroom on the walls somehow. It's really nasty. And the problem is that it's a public resource. It's a public bathroom, meaning that people get away with this kind of stuff, and it is nasty, right? So that is essentially a tragedy of the commons. Now, let's focus on agricultural practices. So this is actually a very important topic you need to know for the exam. All right, you need to know agricultural practices, and you also got to know something known as the Green Revolution. All right, Green Revolution. Okay, let's get started on the good stuff. So the Green Revolution is actually where all of these sort of agricultural practices I'm about to talk about, it's actually how a lot of them got created. The Green Revolution was during the 1940s to 1980s, and it was an effort to increase our food production. All right, so we started using genetically modified crops. You might know GMOs, right? We also have fertilizers, so fertilizers for our crops. We started doing something called pesticides. We started grading pesticides, as well as doing something called monocropping. Monocropping. Monocropping is just when you plant the same thing over and over again. So if I'm monocropping corn, I'm just keep on planting the same crop over and over again. I'm keep on planting corn, right? I have mechanization as well, using tractors and stuff. I'm just gonna write mechs for short, and irrigation as well. So sometimes what can happen is if a place does not have that much water, what you can do is you can take water out of a river, for example, and sort of irrigate it, right? You transport that water to the plant so that it can actually grow. Now, all of these things are used to increase crop production. But what are some of the drawbacks of it? So GMOs, they reduce genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is important because it builds sort of resilience for an ecosystem. GMOs, right? A lot of times, what happens with GMOs is this is actually kind of paired up with monocropping. A lot of times, what happens is you have GMOs which kind of increase crop production, and they're being monocropped, meaning that they're planted like excessively. And this means that if there's ever a disease that occurs, well, that's probably going to wipe out all of the GMOs because they're the same plant, right? If there was more diversity, well, they would be more resilient to any disturbances in the environment. But because they're the same plant, well, can't really stop the disease if they, you know, if it kills all of it, right? If it kills a couple, it's most likely going to kill, probably the rest of them. All right. Now, fertilizers. Fertilizers increase crop yield, but if used sort of excessively, it can cause something called eutrophication. So basically, what can happen is the fertilizer, it runs off into lakes. You have a lake here, fertilizer runs off into the lake. And what can happen is that algae in the lake can start growing. So these plants in the lake, they start growing. Because a lot of them grow at the same time, well, think about it. If you have many things growing at the same time, eventually they're all going to die at some point. So then all these plants die. Now, when stuff dies, what happens? Bacteria decomposes it. So all this bacteria is going to decompose my dead plants. Bacteria needs oxygen. Bacteria needs oxygen in order to decompose all of these plants. So as more plants die, and as an excessive amount of plants die, you're going to need more and more oxygen, right? And that's going to start taking away from the oxygen that the fish actually need, all of the sort of water animals, marine animals need, right? Because the bacteria are using all this oxygen, well, the fish can't have the oxygen, right? Fish also need oxygen, so this faces a sort of problem, right? This is a problem. All right, now we have using pesticides. Now, pesticides are used for pests. Now, what exactly are pests? When you think of pests, you think of mosquito, something annoying, maybe like a bug or something, like a fly. A pest is literally just, um, how do I say this? I mean, it's essentially any sort of organism that sort of interferes with crops or damages crops. Like you think about something eating away at a crop. Let's say you have like a I don't know, like a rat eating away at like a vegetable, for example. That would be an example of pest. It's damaging crops. It's damaging livestock. It can even damage human activities, normal human activities. Like think about like the rats in the subway, right? So you have insects. You might have like weeds, for example. You might have like rodents, birds, whatever. And the problem is, you want to get rid of those pests because, well, they eat away at your plants. They decrease the crop yield, right? You want to make money. You want to sell these crops, but the animals disturb you. So you're going to use pesticides. Now, the problem with pesticides is that once again, they can run off. Once again, I'm going to be using this word a lot. Stuff runs off into rivers. Fertilizers run off into rivers. Pesticides run off into rivers as well, and that can severely damage the animals living there. You can have what can also happen is that when you're using pesticides, right, that can actually cause the bugs, or it can actually cause pesticides can actually cause pests to actually get stronger in the long term. Pests are smart; they're going to be able to adapt. And what's going to happen is the pests are actually going to start to get resistant to the pesticide. So the pesticide is going to get less and less effective at actually repelling the pests. In addition, you can also kill something known as non-target species. And this is exactly what it sounds like. Non-target species are the species that you didn't want to target in the first place. For example, bees. Bees are good pollinators for your flowers. While using pesticides, whoops, you accidentally killed them. You didn't mean to kill them, but they still got killed in the process. That's bad, right? Kill ladybugs. Ladybugs, they eat pests. Maybe even some birds and frogs, right? They all get killed. So that is just some of the problems of pesticides. Now, a solution to this is something known as integrated pest management, which I am not going to write out fully, but integrated pest management, IPM. What pest management does is it tries to minimize the use of pesticides while still trying to find ways to kind of decrease the amount of pests. So you're trying to decrease the amount of pests, but you're trying to minimize the use of pesticides. So one example of this is using a physical barrier. So if your plants are here, let's say these are your plants, well, just use some sort of cover. Just use some sort of cover that still allows the sunlight in, right? Use some sort of yellow cover or something like that. I don't know, black cover, whatever. But the point is that this is a physical barrier that the pests cannot actually get through. Another way is if you're ever asked this on an FRQ, the easiest answer is one example of an integrated pest management practice is you introduce a biological predator. All right, a predator. This is one important, kind of the easiest example to know. If you want pests to be gone, just introduce a predator to that pest, and it's going to die, right? Um, you can still use pesticides, but you want to limit that, so you probably shouldn't say that. You can also use crop rotation. That this is another sort of agricultural practice, crop rotation, and this actually has benefits as well. So what can actually happen is that let's say if you're doing let's say if you're actually doing monocropping. So monocropping, you plant the same plant over and over again. Now, what this can do is it can actually deplete the soil, right? If you just plant the same thing over and over again, it's eventually going to deplete the nutrients in the soil, right? So with crop rotation, you're going to have one type of crop here, let's just say, and then maybe next year you plant a different type of crop. And this way you can kind of keep the nutrients fresh in the soil because you have certain crops like sort of legumes. And what legumes do is they fix nitrogen. So they allow nitrogen, which is one component of the soil that allows plants to grow. What legumes do is they basically fix nitrogen. So all the nitrogen in our atmosphere, they essentially convert it into a more usable form in the soil. So that means that next year, if you're trying to replant the same crop, well, now you have all this extra nitrogen that can be used by this plant. So originally, the plant used up all the nitrogen. Then next year, you plant legumes, so you get more nitrogen. And then next year, now your plant has more nitrogen in order to kind of use. And in addition, let's just say that rats, let's say you have rats, for example. Let's say rats like to eat the green plant. Well, what can happen is you can also use crop rotation to solve this problem. So rats come in, they eat the plant. So what you do is rats are rats are kind of smart, right? Rats are going to try to kind of go to the same place every time in order to get food. So they see that food is at this location. Okay. They go here, they eat the plant, they do this, let's just say every day. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to do a little switcheroo on the rat. You're going to switch the plant so that now this rat sees this new plant and it's like, whoa, what happened to the original plant? And it's not going to eat this new plant. And then next year, once the rats kind of ran away from your area because it sees that it has no food, then you replant the original plant. And then now the rats will not be there. So there are some very clever strategies you can use to sort of mitigate the effects of your pests. Now, let's get started with mechanization. So mechanization is using stuff like tractors, and I mean you can like plow and haul the plants. You can sort of it's called a seed drill. So what it does is like imagine like a tractor that basically like shoots out seeds and that allows for sort of efficient planting. You can use it for spraying pesticides, for irrigation sort of pumps, right? But essentially, mechanization is the use of machines instead of animal or human labor to perform any sort of agricultural related tasks. Okay. So one example of this is something known as tilling, which is another agricultural practice. Tilling is essentially when you turn over the soil. So you want to make the soil loose, right? So let's say this is all my soil. What you're going to do is you're going to essentially turn the soil over. So imagine if I just grabbed a shovel or something and I turn the soil over, and in comes the new sort of underground deep soil up top. So this is all the new sort of soil I kind of dug up. All right. Now it allows an oxygen to come in because remember, plants also need oxygen, right? So it aerates the soil and it helps control weeds because you sort of uproot the soil, and it also helps sort of mix fertilizer into the soil, and it also makes planting easier. So there are a lot of benefits with tilling. However, the problem with tilling is that it can lead to something known as soil erosion, and you'll probably hear this word a million times in your classes. What's going to happen is when soil becomes very loose, right? What's going to happen is wind can blow the soil. The soil can get into rivers and stuff. It can run off into rivers. It can run off into whatever waterways there are. And once again, if the soil contains fertilizers, what does that cause? Eutrophication. All right, and it can literally just soil in the water can just be a bad thing because imagine if this is like a layer of water, for example, right? This is a layer of water. There are maybe fishes that live in the bottom. Maybe there's fishes that live in the bottom layer. Maybe fishes that live in the middle layer. But imagine if you have all the soil at the top layer of the water. Now what happens is that, well, sunlight is not going to be penetrating through, right? Less sunlight is actually going to be going through our sort of water. So that means fish is less able to see. Plants are less able to grow with less sunlight. So just having soil in the water and actually increasing the turbidity of the water, the cloudiness level essentially of the water, that's also a bad thing that you should try to avoid. So there's also a couple more things I want to talk about. Let's say on FRQ, you wanted to identify a disadvantage of tilling, and you say one of the examples. Hold on, let me just rephrase myself. Let's just say on FRQ, you get a problem saying, what is one advantage of tilling? Or what is one problem of tilling? And you say maybe the advantage is, I don't know, the advantage is that it aerates the soil, but then one disadvantage is that, well, it causes soil erosion. And sometimes what the FRQ would do, it will ask you to provide a solution to tilling. So what can you do instead of tilling? And the easiest solution you can think about is just no-till agriculture. That is the easiest sort of thing you can just think about. All right. So no-till agriculture is the solution. Very easy. Just don't till. Now let's actually get into a little bit of irrigation. So irrigation, use water from another source, right, to water your plants. All right. Now, this increases your crop yield, of course, but there are some problems with this. But first, let's just talk about the types of irrigation. And I'm going to list them from most effective to the least effective. So at the top, you have drip irrigation, then you have spray irrigation, then I'm pretty sure you have flood and then furrow. Flood and then you have furrow irrigation. So this is from most effective to least effective in terms of water loss. You don't want to use like a least effective like irrigation because something called salt salinization can occur, which is when soil it gets a little too salty. So let's say if these are your plants, right? You're trying to water them. Now, what happens is you're a really bad farmer. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna place a lot of water over the plants. Now, not only does this cause something known as waterlogging, where the plant essentially just drowns, right? You're placing too much water. This is going to waterlog the plant. The plant can't handle this much water. But another problem with this is soil salinization. Now, I'm not going to spell that all out because I'm lazy. What essentially happens is all this water is going to be evaporated. All right, all the water here is going to be evaporated. And water contains salt, right? A lot of water sources, they're going to have at least some amount of salt. So if the water evaporates, all that's left with is salt. Too much salt, it's going to be bad for your plants. So yeah, the high salt concentration effectively makes the plant very bad at absorbing water, and that is a big no-no for the plants. All right, so that is sort of some bad stuff about irrigation. Of course, there are concerns about maybe using irrigation for plants when maybe it should be used for humans for drinking water instead. Or maybe in like some areas, right, fresh water might be limited, and drinking water is like a basic human like need, right? So it should take priority over irrigation. So there are a little bit of ethics and stuff that are going into play here. Now, irrigation can also sort of involve actually, and um, let me just give you actually a real life example. It was like, is it called Ogallala Waterway? Pretty sure it's called Ogallala Waterway. It's a very weird name. It's like Ogallala and then it's like Waterway. I'm not sure if I've spelled this correctly. Actually, I think it's the Ogallala Aquifer, the Ogallala Aquifer. But anyways, whatever the name is called, essentially this aquifer is being depleted due to human use of it for irrigation. So this is being depleted because we are using too much of this waterway for irrigation, and that is depleting everything. All right. You also have something known as saltwater intrusion. So speaking of aquifers, I'm just going to talk about saltwater intrusion. This is like a completely like separate topic. This is going to be dealing with like freshwater stuff. So um, let's just say if you have fresh water here, and let's say if you have ocean salty water here. All right. Now, let's say the fresh water is being pumped out for humans to drink, for example. All right. Now, if you pump too much of it out, what's actually going to happen is the salt water is going to start intruding, right? It's going to start coming in, and instead of fresh water coming out, then you're going to have salt water coming out, which you can't really drink, right? So that is just saltwater intrusion. That's just another thing, another just quick thing to know. So then after all of this, let's just start talking about animals now. So let's just start talking about meat production. All right, I like meat. I like steak, I like fried chicken. I don't know. I like. Have y'all ever ate like crocodile meat before? I wonder how that tastes like. I heard it tastes like chicken. I don't want to eat it. But anyways, you have something known as CAFOs, which are basically whenever you hear of animal cruelty when you're producing food, you're probably thinking of CAFOs. It's basically they freaking pack all the animals in one area, freaking feed them so much, and it is efficient. You do get a lot, but it requires antibiotics, right? Because imagine if you have a pig farm, a pig cave. Actually, why did I say a pig CAFO? A cow CAFO. All right, that is just use cow CAFO. That's the easiest example. Here are all the cows clumped up in one area. Obviously, disease is going to spread, right? Because they're all in one area. So you're going to need to use antibiotics. So um, I'm just going to put AB for antibiotics. In addition, it's going to release a lot of methane because, well, when cows burp and when cows fart, that releases methane. And methane into the atmosphere is a greenhouse gas, so actually it contributes to global warming. In addition, I know we were thinking cow poop, all the waste. Think about all the waste. If that runs off into a river, it's gonna be pretty bad. Um, there's also something known as free range grazing, which is literally exactly what it sounds like. Free range grazing, which is like a sort of more humane alternative. But then the problem is that it needs more land, and like that's costly, right? So that is a drawback. Now let me talk about mining. Let's talk about mining. So you have kind of two types of mining, right? You have sort of surface mining. You have mining that could be on the surface, and you can be mining on the subsurface, which is what most people think about when they think about mining. Let me get a diagram actually. All right, so mountaintop removal mining. This is at the surface, right? So all of this right over here, surface mining, and also open pit mining here, strip mining here, right? All these are examples of surface mining. Mountain mop removal, worse because you're literally using freaking dynamite to blow up the mountain to remove it, mountaintop. Then you're going to get to subsurface mining, which is usually what people think of when they think of mining, right? You think of mining sort of underground. So subsurface mining can be dangerous, right? Because you need a way to transport these people down. It could be expensive, right? It could be dangerous because, I mean, if you literally are mining beneath, there's always chances that like rocks fall on you, like you could like suffocate to death because oxygen levels are very low there. Um, it's just like breathing hazard as well, so that is pretty bad. Of course, with mining, there's going to be a lot of habitat loss, right, for animals, especially if it's surface mining, right? There's going to be a lot of soil erosion that occurs, right, and there's also going to be sort of air or maybe potential water pollution from all of that sediment or all of that dirt that, not dirt but soil, right? All of that soil that you're removing. Now, usually you want to be mining for minerals, ores, right? Iron, gold, stuff like that. However, you can actually cause something known as acid mine drainage, and I'm pretty sure that this is how the formula goes. So this H2O, that's going to yield, I'm pretty sure Fe2 plus, and then H2SO4. H2SO4. Okay, so what's happening in this chemical reaction? So you're going to have something known as pyrite, and pyrite actually comes from sort of exposed sort of rock surfaces. So when you have sort of exposed rock surfaces, that's going to react with oxygen and water. So I'm going to put oxygen as well. And what that's going to do is that's going to form sulfuric acid, which is H2SO4. Now, this acid can potentially dissolve heavy metals, so it can dissolve lead, arsenic, mercury, and then it could go to nearby streams where, well, if you have acid going to water, that can lower the pH of the water. And essentially, it's just like our blood, for example. Our blood has to be in like a fixed pH range or like a pretty narrow range in order for us to survive. And that is the case for a lot of animals. That is their ecological range of tolerance. There is a pH range that an animal can sort of tolerate at first. If you start to move outside that range in either direction, then, well, they're going to have increased chance of death, right? They're going to have stuff that's going to happen to them. So lowering the pH with this acid can also make it so that toxic heavy metals can get into the water, right? pH pushes the animals out of their ecological range of tolerance. So those are all sort of things that you can say about mining, along with habitat destruction and soil erosion. All right, so now let's just talk about urban areas. So let's just talk about, in this case, urban areas, so cities, right? When we build cities, what do you usually see? Let's just say this is a road in a city, all right, and this is the street. This is our sidewalks at the side, right? Now, all of these, you'll typically see them in a gray color, or you'll see them being made out of something known as asphalt, right? They're going to be a very dark color. When cities are built, there's going to be a lot of dark color, and dark colors absorb a lot of heat, right? So heat from the sun is going to be, a lot of them is going to be absorbed. This is something known as albedo. Essentially, darker surfaces have a low albedo. And albedo just means like reflectiveness. So dark objects do not reflect that much sunlight. It's going to absorb a lot of that heat, right? So you'll typically find that urban areas are going to be hotter than sort of areas where there might be a lot of trees, right? So that can be kind of a disadvantage there. It can also be habitat fragmentation, right? Because with cities, you're gonna have to build all these roads from an environment that originally maybe was a forest, right? So you're gonna sort of fragment the original habitat. And in addition, speaking of the asphalt, if you pour water down asphalt, a lot of it will not actually sort of get absorbed underground. A lot of it will actually run off. So this poses a problem because asphalt does not really absorb water that well. So a lot of it can potentially run off into rivers as well, right? There can be potential for flooding to happen, especially since like pesticides might be used. If pesticides and fertilizers are used near this area, well, that's going to be pretty bad. You can also have cars, right? Cars, urban areas. Cars can be, dripping oil out of their sort of tube, right? So that can be bad. Cars also release fossil fuels, which contribute to global warming. That's bad, right? So basically, in an urban area, you're just going to have increased resource use, but also increased amount of waste. So some of the solutions of this are, you can start building up instead of out. So what essentially, right? Let's just say, you have like a building like this. This is your city. Instead of expanding outwards where you're taking up more space and destroying more habitats, build upwards. So you're actually building upwards. All right. Not only is everything closer together, so you don't really have to travel as far, but also less habitat fragmentation, right? Less habitat destruction. So you can build up, not out. You can also implement something known as green infrastructure. So maybe green roofs, for example. So maybe you put some. Um, I've actually seen pictures where people actually place some green plants, maybe at the side of the building, and essentially what the green plants do is it. And not only does it take in CO2 from the atmosphere, which kind of mitigates the effects of climate change a little bit, right, by absorbing carbon dioxide, but it also makes it so that you reflect a lot of the light, right? Because dark objects absorb light, or the sunlight, and then you have lighter objects which have a high albedo, meaning that they reflect a lot of light. So it's not going to be as hot. All right. Finally, we're going to talk about actually not finally. We're going to talk about aquaculture now. Aquaculture is literally just CAFOs, except you're using it for like fish. So it's going to be like underground, right? Fish are going to be kept in this breeding area, all going to be packed together. So therefore, there's probably going to be a lot of antibiotics, once again, that are going to be used. A lot of waste that's going to be produced. And in addition, the fish can escape. And when the fish can escape, that can be pretty bad because then the fish can maybe become an invasive species, and that can be pretty bad. Or you're going to learn about invasive species in Unit 9, but probably you've heard of invasive species before, so hopefully that's not too bad. I guess you can talk about for maybe like a solution to this. Maybe you can do like what is it called? There was something. Let me see if I remember this. There was, oh yeah, the closed contamination system. So basically, like literally, it's like closed and it's like preventing contamination. All right, the closed contamination system. So literally, you can raise the fish instead of raising them inside the water where they can contaminate them in water. Imagine a giant fish tank on land where all the fishes reproduce and everything, and essentially no waste goes into the water. So there's sort of no direct contact between your farmed fish and the ecosystem, right? Finally, let's just end off with sustainability. So, how can we as humans use sustainable practices? Sustainable just means that, like, basically, it's like practices which we can use for a very, very long time, right? Because right now, if you're using like fossil fuels, for example, that is not sustainable because it's eventually going to run out. We want to make sure that we're using practices that can go on for generations and generations without, causing harm to our environment or minimizing harm to the environment. So some of the sustainable practices, I'm just going to be listing them off. So we talked about crop rotation, right? We rotate different crops every season, provide soil nutrients, reduces pests, right? Rotational grazing is another one. Rotational grazing. And the reason why this is helpful is because especially if you're dealing with like a cow farm, like something like a CAFO, for example. Let's just say, actually, no, not CAFO, like a free range cattle. Let's just say if this is all the grass, right? Let's just say this is all grass. But the problem is that all the cows are feeding in one area, and that's actually going to make the grass super short. And what's going to happen is that increases the chance for soil erosion to happen, right? Because literally that area is going to be completely bare. So what's going to happen is rotational grazing is literally just you move sort of the cows to another area so they graze here, while the plants here regrow back. So then you can kind of repeat this cycle over and over again. Then you, of course, have integrated pest management. You have no-till agriculture. You can use efficient irrigation. So the irrigation methods I talked about, drip irrigation, right? So that is an example of efficient irrigation. You can use sort of sustainable aquaculture. So like what I said, like the closed system aquaculture for like the fishes and stuff like that. Um, that is another one. You can also try to plant as much trees as you can. The more trees you have, trees are like crazy good. The reason why? Well, let's say all of this is soil right over here. What trees essentially do, what trees essentially do is they have roots. Of course, trees have roots, and they're going to anchor themselves to the soil. So that prevents the soil from soil erosion, essentially. All right. And maybe more sort of general sustainable practices for humans, maybe like um, things you might do every single day. So one thing you can do, reduce, reuse, recycle, of course. You can use public transportations, because public transportations, you can use one bus. You can use one bus, and that's going to carry like, I'm just going to say 50 people, right? And that's better than using 50 cars, right? That's better than using 50 cars, right? Just using one bus to get to specific locations, that's gonna save you so much in terms of like your damage to the environment, because 50 cars that releases so much fossil fuels into our atmosphere versus public transportation like a bus where you only have the effect of only one sort of item releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. All right. You can conserve energy at home. So whenever you're not using something, turn it off. So turn off lights, electronics when you're not really using it, right? And conserve water as well. Maybe collect rainwater and use it for native plants instead of using like water from like somewhere else, like your sink or something. All right. So there we go. Um, you This is Unit 5, very important unit, and some study tips for this. If you want to study for APES, I recommend you study Unit 5, because that is literally like, I feel like that is a lot of that FRQ section. It was literally just Unit 5 as well as Unit 9. And I'm pretty much these units just carry the entire APES course. Like all the other units, they're important, but I found that these two units are like the most important thing. Maybe a little bit of Unit 6 or something, maybe a bit of the Unit 7, Unit 8, but it's like Unit 5 and 9, just do this. All right. If you're trying to study like for last minute, all right. But I recommend watching other videos. If you want like unit recaps, like there are other videos online. I'll probably make videos on this also for the other units, but yeah, this is just like the most important one.